Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I hope you can all hear me. We have to do the customary digital check-ins now, so just give me a thumbs up, Sebastian, if that's okay. Great. All right, as I said, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd just like to say I hope you're all safe, fit and well and enjoying the slow march towards a summer without lockdowns and mask wearing. You know, we'll be able to shake hands and we'll be able to hug again. It's going to be a genuine summer of love ahead of us, so something to enjoy. But first of all, we get to enjoy this nice, interesting workshop that we have ahead of us today. So secondly, I'd like to give you all a warm welcome and thank you all for joining our online policy and recommendations workshop. I'm Dr. John Moody, for a senior researcher at Nordregio Research Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. And today I'm sitting alongside my great colleague, Dr. Nora Sanchez-Gassan. And together we're going to guide you through today's festivities, hopefully have some interesting and fruitful discussions along the way. So to give you a little bit of background on this workshop, it's an integral part of the ongoing ESPON project entitled Territorial Impacts of COVID-19 and Policy Answers in European Cities and Regions. Now, I realize we probably should have come up with a sexy acronym, but that's something to think about in the future. But the overall aim of this workshop is to provide you all with an overview of the key conclusions and recommendations which have emerged from the ESPON COVID-19 project research. And today we particularly want to focus on assessing the validity and feasibility of the project recommendations that we've come up with. However, what's equally important to us is that we don't want this to be a one-way sharing of information from our side. Because no civilized humans should have to sit and listen to me and Nora ramble on for an hour and a half. What we really want is this to be an interactive experience because we think it's really important and we think it's a really good opportunity for all of us to be able to share local level policy experiences and learnings which have come from different regions throughout the crisis. So what, in addition to providing you with findings from the project, what we also want to know is, you know, what does the policy response to the crisis look like across different European regions outside of the project focus. So we hope you all had a relaxing lunch and we hope you've had your afternoon coffees and you're feeling energized and ready to actively engage in some proactive discussions. So we've got a packed agenda today. So I'd like to start by handing the floor over to our good colleague, Dermish Guri from the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, who'd like to say a couple of introductory words and give us some insights into what the CEMR have been up to in relation to COVID. So I'll hand over to you, Dermish. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for passing the floor to me. So first of all, I'd like to thank a lot all the participants, CEMR members and project partners, and of course to our colleagues from CEMR who are here with us today to exchange on the policy recommendations. So I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Council of European Municipalities and Regions. It's of course a pleasure to open the ESPON workshop on territorial impact on COVID-19 and the policy answers in European regions and cities. I thank all of you for being present and having, let's say, showing a strong commitment to the topic, but also to the events organized by CEMR in the pillar of knowledge sharing. I would like just to say a few words, because you already said, John, much about the agenda of today, but just say that this event today, this workshop, is made possible thanks to the ESPON program and to the project itself, which is aiming at analyzing geographical patterns and territorial impacts on pandemic across the European Union, examine the regional local level policy response to the crisis. But what is more and even more interesting is to investigate a bit further whether this crisis presented a window of opportunity, let's say, to create or give to local actors a potential to promote their policies across a regional and national level in terms of planning and implementation of concrete actions in relation to the just transition, green transition, and smart transition. Of course, as you might know, covering a broad range of policy areas, CMR is promoting the implementation of holistic and an integrated transversal approach when we tackle issues linked to local and regional governments. So just for those who are probably not so aware about our work on COVID, just to remind you that the CMR immediately when the COVID-19 started, we have created a task force with our members. And I'm pleased to have here my colleague Carol, who followed very closely their work. With the request from our members, we organized this task force from March, if I'm not mistaken, to December 2020. We really looked into, various aspects from COVID-19, how the local regional governments were impacted, exchanging between our partners and our associations, of course, to share also good practices on the best way how local governments can tackle such issue. So this study came at the right time indeed, because thanks to the study, we understand that we're going to have some case studies on the way how local regional governments acted and the various policies that they put in place and actions undertaken, but also some policy recommendations that are very important, not only for this crisis that it looks at, other crises will come in the future, and we should make our cities, let's say, resilient. So today, it's very important, this piece of work and those policy recommendations for our relevant policy or expert groups, as you might know, on the local finance, cohesion policy, and territorial development, governance, and gender equality. So our member associations are, of course, present today, those who are members of those expert groups, but also my colleagues coordinating those expert groups. And today's agenda, as you introduced, John, we are pleased to hear from your colleague Nora, from our colleague Nora, let's say, about the policy response to the crisis, and then to have, of course, a discussion with us on that, and of course, looking forward to listen to her from you, John, the policy recommendations, and of course, as I said, I'm happy that Carol is with me. She's going to conclude by highlighting why such policy recommendations are important for CMR, for our members, and the next steps on the usefulness and how we can make full use of such recommendations in our work. And now I'd like also to invite my colleague from the ESPON program, Andrea Shina, to give an introduction and how this project is important also for the ESPON program. And we love at CMR to see in future further research projects that are, let's say, tackling issues at the local level. And then, of course, Sebastian, so thank you very much for continuing and leading this partnership, which is producing a meaningful policy recommendation. I'd like to thank all the participants and wishing a very successful event. I'll be with you and contributing with other my colleagues here to the discussion on the policy recommendations. So thank you very much, and we are closely going to follow and provide you feedback to the policy recommendation. Thanks a lot, and I'm passing the floor to my colleague Andrea Schnapp from the ESPON program. Thank you. I tried, John, to keep it short.
Dear Dermish, dear John, thank you very much for this quite extensive and on-point introduction. Dear ESPON friends, welcome and thank you for responding in such a positive way to our dedicated workshop. My name is Andrea China, and I'm one of the two experts, project experts in charge of this nice and challenging project here at ESPON. As you may know, just a brief description of ESPON and what we do here. It's a territorial cooperation program, which plays a specific role in supporting policy development, institutional capacity, effective policy making, and efficient public administration, and all while delivering European territorial evidence. So in this context, we are trying to be as agile as possible in supporting our partners and stakeholders. And through our projects, we try to respond to real-time needs This is how the territorial impacts of COVID and policy answers in European regions and cities was born and launched in July. This is one applied research that is 1.5 years long and has an European-wide coverage. And aims at delivering territorial analysis, understanding the geographical patterns of the COVID pandemic, also while looking at the socioeconomic effects of the containment measurements. Secondly, this research activity aims to provide evidence on the added value of policy measures and cities and regions apply to respond to the socioeconomic effects of containment measures. So in this context, this is why we are gathered here today to discuss more and to enhance our recommendations and to better tailor them so that we can effectively support the policymakers in the recovery from the crisis. I will stop here my intervention and give the floor to the team in charge of delivering the project. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Andrea and Dermish. It's great to see so many different institutions actually working on similar topics, and I think this does provide a really good opportunity for knowledge sharing across the different institutions. Before we move forward, I don't know if Sebastian, as our team leader and supreme leader, do you want to say any words before we move on?
Yes, just to mention that this project is a project that is about thinking about the future of the policy responses to future crises. And in this project, we have also worked on the analysis of the geographical pattern of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we try to understand what was the main factors that can explain the geographical patterns of the COVID-19. And we also try to assess to which degree the poverty, the social inequalities and social exclusion have been affected by this pandemic and the subsequent lockdown measures. So basically this workshop is part of a broader project on the geography of COVID-19 and the territorial impacts. And here today, we are going to more focus on the proactive policy approaches to coping with the pandemic. So yes, I leave you the floor, and I'm ready also to attend to this meeting.
Thanks, Sebastian. That's great. Okay, just before we get on with the presentation, I just want to give you a little bit of background information, which is quite important here. So a central part of the project was conducting a number of case studies. And the primary focus of these case studies was analysing the policy response to the crisis across 14 different types of regions, both inside and outside of Europe. So my colleague Nora is going to provide us with an overview of some of the key policy findings we identified from across these case study regions. And we think it's important that you have this contextual information, is providing a firmer foundation for understanding the policy recommendations that we're going to present in the second half of the workshop. Also important to know is that we are joined today by many of the case study leaders. So if you have any specific questions regarding any of the individual 14 cases that we looked at, please feel free to ask, and I'm sure our colleagues will be happy to provide you with some more specific answers on the case studies. And also, just to reiterate, we really want this to be an interactive event. So, because it's really important that we can learn and share from each other's experience. So throughout the workshop, please feel free to use the chat function to add questions and comments, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So please don't be shy. There are no silly questions. There are no right or wrong answers. So please feel free to contribute. So now I welcome my colleague Nora and hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And also from my side, welcome everyone. My name is Nora Sanchez-Gassen. I work as a senior researcher together with John at Nordregio in Stockholm, and I am one of the researchers who were involved in this really interesting project on territorial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and policy answers in European regions and cities. And as the title of this project already suggests, one of the questions we were really interested in this project is to see how cities and regions in Europe responded to the pandemic. And in my presentation, I want to give you some of our insights, some of the findings we got, some of the policies we encountered. I will try to give you an overview, and it would be really good if you could follow along, see what you think, reflect perhaps on your own experiences in your municipalities, or if you work with municipalities, does this reflect your impression from the pandemic? Is there any good practices that you are aware of that could be useful to highlight? And I'd like to have this discussion with you at the end and hear what you think. I also apologize in advance. We had some technical challenges. So now Sebastian is sharing the slides, and I will have to tell him when to take the next slide. I hope you can see over this. So we, of course, know that when the pandemic hit Europe, this presented, first of all, a very immediate and very important health crisis in Europe. And municipalities and regions were really challenged to, in the first place, deal with the health impacts of the pandemic, keep infection rates low, inform the population on how to keep safe, and also help those that got sick during the pandemic. Of course, these were first and foremost the most pressing obligations of regions and municipalities. Nonetheless, in this project, we wanted to go one step further. We asked if the pandemic was perhaps also a time for more proactive policy measures, where more proactive policy measures could be put in place. And with proactive measures, what we meant here were policy measures where municipalities and regions perhaps tried to adapt to the pandemic context, where they perhaps tried to adjust societies, economies to the new environment, to the pandemic situation. And also, especially, we were looking for measures that perhaps not even sort of try to deal with the pandemic, but capitalize on the pandemic, perhaps use this context to speed up certain transitions or to implement certain policy goals. So proactive measures that sort of used this pandemic context is what we were really interested in, if we found anything there in Europe. So in other words, as Dermish also already mentioned, we were asking, was the pandemic, apart from being a crisis, could it have also been a window of opportunity to promote certain policy goals? And of course, then finally, we were also interested in finding out if there are any best practices, any good examples that we can learn from for the next crisis, perhaps any policies that are worth keeping after the pandemic, so that are worth even using beyond a pandemic context. So this is what we were really interested in. Next slide, please, Sebastian. And when we say proactive policies, we're actually particularly looking at three different policy areas that also Dermish already briefly mentioned. We were interested in specifically what we called the just transition policies. And here we looked into social policies in a quite broad sense of the term, but also economic policies. So here we wanted to know, what did municipalities do? Any notable proactive policies here? Secondly, we also were interested in green transition policies. So these were policies perhaps that would have promoted environmental sustainability during the pandemic or accelerated the green transition. We were also interested to find out were municipalities and regions particularly active there. And then finally, we looked into smart transition policies, and these are essentially about digitalization and innovation. So we tried to see, how did municipalities and regions react during the pandemic when we all spent much more time online? What kind of measures did regions and municipalities come up with to support this process? Next slide, Sebastian, please. Yes, and we also already heard that we did our work, that we did our research on the basis of 14 case study areas, and you can see them listed here on the right-hand side. So this included Amsterdam, Athens, Barcelona, Corsica, and Elvas, and the Alentejo border area, but also then gone all the way down to the Azores and La Réunion. In selecting those case study areas, we really tried to take note to have a diverse set of municipalities and areas, both the urban and the rural. We had island context, coastal areas, inland areas, cross-border areas, also case studies with different political systems. So we really try to have a broad outlook in this project to try to capture as many possible policies as we could in different kinds of contexts. Next one, yes. Now, in these 14 different case studies, we had national teams available who conducted interviews for us with civil servants, with policymakers, especially at local level, to find out what kind of policies have been tried and tested during the pandemic in these 14 different areas. And I wanted to start by just sharing some general findings with you that cut across the case studies and that also cut across the policies. So overall, we can say that we were, I think, quite successful. We've identified around 300 policies that we would consider as proactive, that fell into our definition of proactive policy. So 300 policies over these 14 different case studies. So quite a lot of material, quite a lot of initiatives that were really interesting to look at. And for most of these policies, we could also quite clearly classify them as either being in the social or economic area, in the green area, and the smart area. And you see there on the slide the distribution of initiatives that we found. So more than half of the policies, a clear majority, fell into this category of just transition. So there were a lot of measures dealing with all sorts of social challenges or economic challenges. And that is perhaps no surprise, since we know that the COVID-19 pandemic was also an economic crisis with many businesses struggling, people becoming unemployed. So it's perhaps no surprise that our case study areas were quite active in trying to support there. But we also found quite a few smart transition policies and then green transition policies. These were the smallest group of policies that we encountered. Now, and most of these policies that we heard about we could quite clearly group them into these three different categories: the just, the smart, and the green. We also noticed that there were several policies that were actually a bit more cross-cutting, that had a more holistic approach, that tried to address different goals from different, let's say, priority areas at once. And we thought these were often quite interesting policies that created synergies and had really good ideas. So I think we will try to highlight them as well in our report. Another thing that we noticed is that many of the policies that we heard about were quite clearly motivated by the pandemic, of course. They were adopted in a pandemic context and because of the pandemic, and they're often also really focused on addressing immediate challenges that developed because of the pandemic. Nonetheless, we absolutely think that a lot of the policies, perhaps most policies that we heard about, have long-term potential. So even those that were perhaps designed for the pandemic context, many of them absolutely have the potential to be used beyond the pandemic context, or at least to remain part of our institutional memories, so we can use them in the next crisis context. But there's a lot of long-term potential, let's say, in I think almost all of the policies that we found. Now, of course, I wanted to tell you also a little bit about some of the concrete policies we found to describe some of the ideas that we heard about. But as I said before, we found around 300 different policies. So there's no way I can present all of them to you. So we decided that for this presentation, we would focus on the just transition policies. So policies that fall or very broadly defined to deal with social questions and economic questions. So this is what we're going to focus on now on the next slides. But if you're interested in green transition policies or some good examples that fall into the smart transition area, you can ask us or also check our report, which will be published during the summer. Now, even in the just transition policy area, there were a lot of policies that we heard about. So as one of the first things that we did is we tried to see if we could cluster these policies perhaps into topic areas or cluster these policies according to the goals they try to achieve. And I think that would work quite well. We saw a lot of similarities between the case study areas that were emerging. And one big group of policies that we heard about related to business support and the goal to protect businesses, but also ultimately to protect jobs and avoid increases in poverty. And here there were a lot of proactive or quite innovative ideas that municipalities had. We heard, for example, from Amsterdam that cafes and businesses were allowed to use sidewalks without extra fees during the pandemic. The same was done in some other case study areas as well. This was, of course, done with the goal to support businesses, but it, of course, also increased the quality of life in the cities to some extent and allowed people to meet outside, have a meeting space outside. In Milan, we saw that loans were given, for example, to businesses with favorable conditions. But these were not just loans given to financially support the businesses. These loans were coupled with an encouragement to promote digitalization processes or perhaps change the business profile. So there was an incentive also built in to develop further and use the pandemic, perhaps to prepare for future times, to use this as a period to rethink certain things or accelerate certain processes. And in Corsica, another innovative idea that we found was that they developed a platform to connect local consumers and producers. And this is an idea that we also found in some other case study areas that are especially dependent on tourism. Because, of course, for those areas when tourism stopped during the pandemic, this meant that also a lot of income for the businesses suddenly fell away. And here, a lot of these local areas had the ideas to activate the local population, to bring it to their attention what local producers and local businesses have to offer. In one way, of course, this is almost also a sustainability goal, to kind of connect producers and consumers on a local level a bit more strongly, but also, of course, to help the businesses survive the pandemic. So quite a lot of ideas, and I think several of them, take the Corsica example, for example, a lot of them have the potential to be used beyond the pandemic, we would say. And we also saw that municipalities put some focus on providing income support, especially to vulnerable families during the pandemic. And again, there were quite some proactive or innovative ideas there. Again, in Amsterdam, for example, we saw that financial support was also offered to self-employed people if they lost income during the pandemic. But again, this was coupled with offers and an encouragement to reorient themselves and to develop further, to overthink their business strategies and ideas and tools. So again, always this forward-looking perspective to use the pandemic context also in a somewhat productive sense. And then Veszprém in Hungary, that's one of the many other examples where we saw that the municipalities and regions try to step in and top up unemployment benefits or provide grants or in other ways support families financially if incomes had fallen away. Then we also saw that municipalities and regions try to support their population in a quite practical sense, for example, by providing food, medical, and also housing support, trying to ensure that people would not become homeless during the pandemic. Here, Barcelona was one example. Barcelona, again, was one of those case study areas that struggled with tourism, that tourism suddenly stopped in these areas. And that, of course, then also a lot of income fell away. But one of the positive things was that a lot of tourist apartments stood empty during the pandemic. And here the municipalities used those empty apartments to offer them to vulnerable families, for example, when they had to go into quarantine. And perhaps their own apartments were not really suitable for staying at home for longer periods of time if they were, for example, too small or in bad conditions. So here they used these empty apartments to help out vulnerable families over the most challenging times. And in Corsica, there was one example where we saw that investments were made during the pandemic to improve the energy situation of poor families. This was done with the pandemic context in mind, but this is, again, I think one of the very clear examples where municipalities were really forward-looking and investing, trying to build a better connection also for the future and improve sustainability goals. So there were a lot of very concrete ideas, and I can't mention all of them, but a lot of concrete initiatives where municipalities really tried to support their populations, provide them with basic necessities of daily life, food, medicine, and a home. And there were a lot of things to learn from there, I think, and also to use in future crisis contexts. We can go to the next one. Yes, thank you. We also saw that municipalities put a lot of emphasis on social support for specific population groups that were perhaps considered to be a bit more vulnerable during the pandemic or to be in need of additional support. This would have been young people, for example, children, older adults, but also homeless people, for example. There were a lot of targeted measures for these population groups, which generally had the goal to engage these population groups, but also to avoid loneliness. In Malmö, for example, we saw that youth centers in the cities were encouraged to offer digital activities for young people. This was one of the many case studies or many examples that we found in case studies in this area. So the goal here was that, of course, while young people could perhaps no longer meet in person during the pandemic, that there would at least be digital activities available to help them connect and stay in touch and do something meaningful in their free time. And Barcelona was one of the cases where we found an interesting initiative that targeted older people. Here, the municipality established a telephone-operated home care service where basically staff members regularly called the older people living in the city, especially those living alone. On the one hand, to simply hear how they were doing, to also convey information about the pandemic and how to best protect themselves, but also to some extent to reduce feelings of loneliness, to have this kind of contact ongoing with the outside world, with other people. And again, this is one of those key examples where we think this could absolutely be worth considering to use even beyond the pandemic, because some of the challenges that were addressed here with this measure, they are not specific for the pandemic context. They are also there at other times. So one of those good experiences, I think, to learn from. And then we saw that municipalities, our case studies also focused on physical and mental health at large. We all know that the pandemic was not the best time for physical and mental health. Even if we didn't get sick, most of us sat too much, moved too little, gained some extra kilos. It was also a time where many experienced loneliness, even signs of depression. And so here, our case study areas, they really also try to step in and offer solutions. In Helsinki, for example, we could see that the city implemented a free and quick mental health care guarantee with a goal that everyone who would be in need of mental health support in the pandemic should be able to get it within 2 weeks. So they really try to make access or increase the access to get professional support and to make waiting times shorter. In Yassi, very similarly, the city created a social emergency center, and one of the things, one of the support that this center could give was psychological support. In addition, they also provided very basic help with things like food and medicine, for example. But it was one emergency center where people could turn to in case of need. And then again, in Malmö, we saw that funding was given to sports and leisure organizations in the city, again, in an attempt to organize digital activities and keep people engaged, allow people to pursue their hobbies and interests, even in pandemic times, at least to some extent, and to keep them active. Next slide, please. Then another cluster of policies that we found in our case study areas relates to culture. And we know, of course, that the cultural sector was one of those that was particularly affected during the pandemic. And here we saw that the case study areas, on the one hand, try to keep culture alive and bring culture to the population, but on the other hand, also support artists and the cultural sector financially. We found, for example, that in several case study areas, and I mentioned Vesprem here as an example, they encouraged artists different cultural organizations to go out on the street and perform there. So when it was no longer possible to go to theaters and opera houses, etc., to bring the culture out on the street and perhaps even reach new audiences. This was one of the measures that was done in a lot of case study areas. In Helsinki, they also tried to support the cultural sector quite practically and financially. Here, all the employees working within the city organization, they received culture and sports vouchers to be used whenever it was possible again. So it was, in a way, setting an incentive for the employees in the cities to go out and participate in these events again, to increase, of course, the audience also for sports and culture providers, and not least to give a boost with income for these organizations. And as far as I heard, this was a quite popular initiative and one that might live on after the pandemic. And then finally, we also found some quite interesting initiatives that had to do with really using the pandemic as a window of opportunity to make investments in infrastructure and to create jobs. In Amsterdam, for example, we heard about a very interesting initiative. Here, the city, of course, realized that during the pandemic, tourists stayed away from Amsterdam. Many of the locals stayed inside more, were less out and about. So the city was rather empty. And the municipality used this context to then invest in some infrastructure projects and speed up some of the maintenance and renovation. That was anyway planned. So they really tried to use this context where there were less people out in the city center. And while they did that, they also tried to create low-skilled jobs in those projects. So trying to help those that became unemployed during the pandemic. So one of those really nice examples, I think, where different goals were being achieved with one and the same policy. Athens was another example where we saw these kind of investments that could also be useful in the future. Here in Athens, they bought a patrol vessel for the Coast Guard to transport COVID-19 patients between islands. That, of course, was clearly motivated by the pandemic and the needs of the pandemic, but it's one of those investments, again, that has a longer-term function and will be useful also beyond the pandemic context. Next slide, please. And then the last cluster of policies that I wanted to mention to you is related to education. Perhaps not surprisingly, we know that a lot of the education and offers were moved online during the pandemic, both for children and for adults. And that created all sorts of challenges in itself. And here we again saw that municipalities and regions tried to step in and offer some solutions. In Malmö, for example, the city realized quite soon that digital learning didn't function equally well for all groups of children, that some were at risk of falling behind in their learning, that they had difficulty to keep up through these digital channels. And here, Malmö tried to help out, and they offered additional educational offers in summer holidays or school holidays to give more opportunities for these kids to catch up. In Amsterdam, they had a similar goal, but used a different measure. Here, they teamed up older pupils as tutors with younger students. again, with the goal of helping younger kids keep up with their learning, let's say, but this measure also had a sort of social component. They tried to bring kids of different ages again together, which perhaps had not been possible so much during the pandemic. So trying to connect kids again, that was also part of this goal. And then we found several interesting initiatives that were targeting adults, and often these initiatives were about providing new skills and knowledge that was becoming especially relevant during the pandemic. In Elvas, for example, we saw that, or the municipality realized that more helping hands were needed in nursing homes and at the Red Cross in the pandemic. So they tried to come up with a training program to rapidly train some people to help out in these places. And again, I think this could be one of those really interesting examples to learn from, how to make sure, in case there's an urgent need of labor force in specific sectors, how such a training program could be organized at relatively short notice to provide more labor in specific areas or in specific sectors. There might be some interesting things to learn here from this case in Elvas. So this was like a brief overview of some of the policies we found when it comes to the just transition. So these were social policies, very broadly defined, some economic measures. And as I said, we tried to cluster them in groups. And I think now it would be also really interesting to hear from you. So I would really encourage you to share as well in the municipality that perhaps that you live in or work in, or the municipalities that you know about or that you work with. Can you think of any good proactive policies that were implemented there, especially perhaps when it comes to social or economic policies? Any kind of policies with proactive potential there? And if yes, do they fall in the same kind of clusters that we've also identified, or is there perhaps something more? And then perhaps we could also discuss a little bit in general what your impression is. Was the pandemic mainly a crisis situation for municipalities and regions? Or do you also think that this, to some extent at least, constituted a window of opportunity to drive forward the just, green and smart transitions? What is your impression here? So I'd be happy to hear from you about these things. Of course, if you have any questions for us for the presentation, you're also very welcome to ask them. But perhaps otherwise, we could start with this question number one and just reflect on what kind of policies do you know about? Is there anything that you think you could add to our list? We could also have a quick look in the chat.
Yes, do not hesitate to interact on the chat or to unmute your micro and describe what you have seen. Do not hesitate. If you have heard about good practices.
Yes, I see Vince Maple is raising a hand. We cannot hear you. Perhaps you have not unmuted. Vince, could you try again to say something? No, I think we can't hear you still.
Type in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I see you type in the chat. Great. Perhaps in the meantime, Anna from Samband, you also raised your hand. Perhaps we can hop to you and then come back to Vince's question in the chat.
Yes, I just put, 2 Vimeo links in the chat, which are presentations about Icelandic COVID best practices. I think you
Seems
are.
like Anna froze.
I think you should be able to, get translations through the Vimeo, isn't it?
I have to apologize, Anna. We froze for a second, I think, so I didn't hear the beginning of your question.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. I was just explaining that I put 2 Vimeo links, video links in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I explained in the chat. It's about Icelandic COVID best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that Vimeo offers opportunity to translate. If not, I can provide some other information afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Is there perhaps something that you would particularly like to highlight from Iceland?
I mean,
very good
I think
experience.
the cooperation between Samband on behalf of the municipalities and the Ministry of Welfare to secure basic welfare services in time of crisis was quite a success, and it has been a great learning experience, and it has really, you know, been an encouragement to continue like working more closely together, and especially with relation to Reykjavik's experiences. I think the digital, you know, welfare services there was really a push towards them, provided by the COVID experiences, especially in relation to older people, provide them with services. And now Reykjavik has actually established a welfare technology center, which I believe was that the COVID was also, you know, an encouragement in that direction.
So overall, closer cooperation as one of the positive outcomes.
Closer cooperation and also digital, you know, push. And what was, and also more, you know, connection with the general public in that degree that we established, you know, what we called the back force, professional back force, to be available if there was lack of shortage of, you know, professionals and employees in the welfare system. So people volunteered, people with education and experience in the welfare system. They were registered. They registered themselves. So we were able to, you know, get, when there was lack of staff in some municipality, which was faced with, you know, influx, pandemic influx, then you could, you know, send them help.
That sounds like another really interesting initiative to have this.
And we actually have used this, or I think perhaps there wasn't, when it came to the reality, there was much use of it, but now in connection with the Ukrainian influx of refugees, they were at the starting point, there were some fear of that we might not, you know, have enough staff to you know, to service these the refugees that were coming in great numbers at the start from Ukraine. And then we also, you know, used this measure.
Yeah, that's another very good keyword, of course, that perhaps some of these measures, although it's a very different crisis that we're having now, but perhaps some of the measures that worked during the pandemic, like the example you just mentioned, so are useful also to.
Yeah, I think we are getting used to, you know, crisis management, not least here in Iceland, where we had this economic crash 10 years ago. And then we continuously have some, you know, earthquakes and volcanoes, eruptions, and now this. I mean, it's the same principle applied.
Thank you, Anna.
So some are natural catastrophes and others are man-made.
Yeah, exactly. But crisis will come. We can hear from Mariana. I think you also raised your hand. See what you have, your experiences or inputs.
Thank you. I think I can follow straight on actually from Anna. The point about the government, I think, is well made about having to have better connections between local government and national government, so that the national government was forced to come to us when they wanted things done. They first tried to do it centrally. So, for example, they were delivering food to people's houses on a national contract, where that was all organized and delivered nationally, but it failed to pick up the local nuances and the fact that some people were diabetic or had special needs. So better was the local networks that we were able to set up, and also quicker setting those up. And that meant that was a very specific service tailored to individual needs. And I think it's for us, it's been a really good demonstration of the value of local government when times are hard. So we had a resilience board set up between the different local bodies. And so a second point is that it meant that we were working together with other public authorities more closely in our home areas. So I would see that as a second advantage. Thank you.
Yeah, very good points. Very interesting to hear. Thank you. This and I think this is something we also heard, at least between the lines from in our case study areas, that looking at the local level, perhaps even sometimes looking at the neighborhood level, was really, really meaningful and useful in the pandemic to really be able to react quickly to the biggest needs that were there. Thank you. I also see that you're all posting in the chat, and I have a bit of difficulty following in parallel, but I'm sure you all have a look there. So thank you very much for adding also your examples there. We will have a look at them also after the.
Yeah, I think we'll take a comment from Serafan, and then I think Andrea might be able to give us a brief overview of what's been happening in the chat. Serafin.
Thank you. It's great to be part of this discussion, and that we are doing this with yourselves, and the fact that this study also includes the UK, despite of Iceland and Norway, despite of Brexit, which is excellent to be continually sharing with this. My day job is in the Convention for Scottish Local Authorities, but those who don't know me, as you can see, I'm Spanish by origin, and I will use that as actually to comment on that. In terms of the findings and best practices, I mean, the initial presentation very much reflects, I think, the input that I sent on behalf of COSLA a couple of weeks ago in the questionnaire. So that is very much reflects the picture in Scotland as well, apart from what Councillor Overton and the colleagues from the LGA said. My comment is, and I know you are in an early stage of just gathering evidence, would be to appreciate differences in terms of resilience about to respond to COVID crisis. As I mentioned, my day job is in the public sector of Scotland, and that was involving a lot of plans when the COVID crisis started, but also, as I say, I'm Spanish and also academic researcher on things, and I know that extensive work on this particular topic in Spain. And the difference, I'll just say that because, you know, you could see that you could have identical best practice in Spain and the UK, but completely different ways of doing that and completely different outcomes. And a big factor of that is institutional culture. I mean, in Spain, in the continent, is based on traditional French administrative, very legalistic law to make them extremely slow. Whereas in the UK, which is based on this paradise of new public management and settling that there's no administrative law and all these very formal things, I witnessed how entire departments of the government, entire departments of councils and COSLA itself was able to completely reprogram things and do responses in a matter of days. Whereas exactly the same thing in Spain, and I was also researching Italy, took months. Nothing happened. So I think a factor, it's a suggestion for the study, a factor to analyze is how institutional culture affects the resilience of a public administration to actually respond. So it's not just the best practice they're trying to do, but actually how effective it is and how we compare. In my view, from that perspective, a key factor is institutional culture. You see the same outcome in a completely different quality of result and time scales because of the internal institutional culture in one country compared to the other. Thank you.
Exactly. And I think here you also raised this point that we always have with best practices, right? It's often very difficult to just directly take a best practice and bring it in somewhere else. Absolutely. Thank you for this point. To keep that in mind, even in our study when we do recommend best practices.
Correct.
Andrea, I think, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, we are having quite an activity here on chat, and I'd like maybe to ask some of the respondents here, like Mr. Maple, to intervene. If not, I will maybe summarize a bit what he has written here on chat, if he would not, he doesn't want to speak live with us now. So we are receiving some good examples on the work done in regarding tackling street homelessness. Literally 3 days was the urgency, and this is a great example of how local governments can deliver successful stories in difficult circumstances. Then we have received another example from Estonia, where they have, or in the city of Tartu, they have organized car-free avenue for a month, where for the summertime. Also, different activities took place, and this was. This has become a popular activity among people. I would raise a question if this is still the case, like, are they implementing this policy, and or this was one-time event? I think this would be interesting to find out, and if Tiu Madal would like maybe to answer, it would be great. We are having intervention from Iași, Romania, where the focus was more on smart transition, while the green transition measures were overlooked. It is interesting to do for Mr. Eva to see if this is a pattern or was the particular case for the city of Iași, and also understanding if this is more of a concern in regards to quality of life measures, as opposed to the economic growth ones. We also have an example from northern Sweden, where in the 2 municipalities, the local governments offered free lunches from local restaurants to all children in upper education. I assume this was also a one-time event during the pandemic. Yes, we have received from England another link to best practices. I don't know if any of our esteemed participants would like maybe to comment more or draw some attention. Yes, John?
Yeah, thanks for the great overview, Andrea, and it's good to see that we're sharing so many good practices here. I think we'll have to move on to the next stage of the workshop now, but please, those people who have contributed on the board, I think the same themes will start to come up when we're looking at the recommendations, so please feel free to voice your ideas then. So if I could ask Sebastian to move on to the next slide. Okay, super. Right, so now we're moving on to the policy recommendations element of the workshop. So to give you a little bit of background on this, as part of the project terms of reference, we were required to develop a series of different types of recommendations. So what we proposed in our application was to break down these recommendations into different themes. So the first theme was policy recommendations, and that's generally what we've been looking at in the first half. So this is generally referring to the best practices which we found throughout the case studies. We also looked at governance recommendations, which were recommendations which were designed to improve the efficiency of multi-level and cross-sectoral governance. We also tried to zoom in on territorial recommendations. So we were looking at recommendations that came out of the case studies relating to specific types of regions. As Nora said earlier, we looked at quite a few different ones: urban, rural, peri-rural, cross-border. So we found some recommendations in relation to that theme. We also looked at financial recommendations. So this was looking at, was there any innovative financial instruments, public and private financial instruments that had to be created as a result of the crisis. And also, and also we looked at some research recommendations as well. So what are the next steps moving on from this research? So if I could go to the next slide, please, Sebastian. So basically, the recommendations that we've come up with from the project, they reflect a synthesis of recommendations from across the case study findings in the interviews that were conducted, where we actually asked many of the interviewees to provide us with some recommendations themselves. The same kind of themes and ideas were emerging from across the case studies. So the overall aim of this part of the project was to come up with some recommendations that were potentially transferable transferable to different contexts, but mainly recommendations that we thought would be useful for policymakers in trying to overcome the short, medium and long-term impacts of the pandemic. Because I think, you know, at the minute, we're actually living through a period of kind of multiple crises. So, you know, we're not quite out of the woods yet in relation to the pandemic, but also these new crises have started to emerge. You know, I mean, we've got this cost of living crisis now, which is hitting most countries. I think you'll know that, you know, you go to the shops, you're trying to buy your favorite chocolate, it's gone up a couple of euros. It's quite depressing. Then also we have the energy crisis, of course, which has been exacerbated even further by the unfortunate events in Ukraine, in difficult events in Ukraine. So what we're going to do now is we're going to present the main recommendations that we've come up with under each of the recommendation themes. And while we're presenting these recommendations, we'd like to get your inputs and feedback on them to help us improve them. So when we're presenting the recommendations, please can you consider, and I'll ask Sebastian to change slides. So when presenting the recommendations, please can you consider these three questions? So are these recommendations feasible in terms of the development and implementation of them? You know, can these recommendations be reformulated or amended in any way to make them more relevant or impactful? And finally, you know, are there any recommendations from your own experiences which you think we can add to what we found from our own projects? So we'll be really interested to see if you've also been working with recommendations and who those recommendations have been focused and targeted at. So what we're going to start with now first is some general overarching policy recommendations. So I'm going to hand back to my colleague Nora, who's going to present these.
Can you go one slide further again, Sebastian? Yes, before John will talk about some more detailed recommendations later, but when we did this project, we also kind of found there was some kind of overarching recommendations sort of emerging from when you look across policy areas and across the case study. So some of the kind of overarching findings, and we tried to put them here on this quite dense slide, but I will try to talk you through it and summarize the main points. So one of the perhaps very natural things to emerge from this project is that we heard so many good examples of what has worked well during the pandemic. We think some of these policies should simply be extended. They should be used after the pandemic, or at least they should be kept in mind for the next crisis context. As I already said before, there's really so much relevant experience and yeah, so many new insights that we gained that I think we have to kind of bring those further. And many of the policies that we found, they addressed different kind of challenges that also very much apply beyond a pandemic context. So there's really a lot to take further from these experiences in the pandemic. One thing that we also heard from many different people in different areas is this big interest to learn from each other. So there was also, like many of our interview partners raised this point that they would really like to know what happened elsewhere, what kind of good solutions did others come up with, what could we learn from each other. So here I think there's also a need or an interest, not the least at local level, to be able to exchange that. And so we think there should be more opportunities offered here at the local level between different parties there, but going all the way also up to the European level to avoid to allow for these discussions at a European-wide level. Similar a bit to what we're doing here now, by the way. Also, one thing that we thought was quite interested, and that also came up a little bit in the discussion we now had, is that the pandemic did not only lead to good policy solutions, the pandemic was also a context that sometimes put a spotlight on what does not work so well, perhaps in the pandemic. Perhaps during the pandemic, people working in the local authorities found out that perhaps the communication between sectors or the communication with civil society or other stakeholders was not as good as it could be, or perhaps there were rules or regulations in place that slowed them down, that did not allow them to react perhaps as quickly as would have been possible or necessary otherwise. So I think we heard from lots of people that there emerged these kind of moments when people realized perhaps we have to do things differently. And of course, in all our case study countries or areas, solutions were found, quick fixes were found, and all these institutions and organizations moved forward and tried to act as well as they could. But we think that, or we would argue that these kind of moments that we had where we realized what perhaps does not work so well, we should also keep them in mind for the longer term, try to plan for the longer term, try to develop sustainable solutions to improve and perhaps then also be better in the next crisis context. So really use this as an opportunity, the pandemic, and perhaps all these realizations that we made of what works well, what does not work well, to try to develop further. I had mentioned briefly also before that we found some policies in our case study areas that had a more holistic character, where perhaps different sectors worked together, or one and the same policy was implemented to serve different goals. There were a lot of these really interesting holistic policies that emerged. So we also put this as one of the recommendations, to think holistically and across sectors and across policy areas whenever possible, to see if there's synergies or if funding could be pooled to achieve a bigger impact, for example. So it seemed to us that in the case study area, some of these more holistic policies were really interesting and had good effects. Then one other thing to notice that John already mentioned, we're not quite out of the woods yet. More crises are emerging, putting or creating new challenges for us to deal with. And during the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on different vulnerable groups in societies. Children, for example, older adults, homeless people, families with low incomes, for example. And many of the impacts that we saw on the pandemic are not quite over. They're still there at the same time as new challenges are going on. So we would also recommend to keep the focus on these groups. If you think about children, for example, and I mentioned that I think this is an experience that was felt across Europe, that some kids were falling behind in their learning when teaching was done digitally. Well, some of these impacts, they just not disappear, as these children still need our support going forward to be able to catch up. And in the same way, there's a lot of other impacts from the pandemic that we still need to work with. So keeping this focus on vulnerable groups going forward is important, we think. And then a final kind of general conclusion we had, or a general recommendation, is to really learn or build on the experience we've made in the pandemic when it comes to communicating policies. We know that in the pandemic, it was absolutely crucial that citizens did their part, that everyone helped to try to reduce infection rates and stay safe. And it was very crucial to get information out, reliable information to different populations. And in the beginning, I think in many countries, there were some difficulties in reaching all population groups, but very quickly solutions were found, for example, providing information in different languages, involving the civil sector, for example, working with representatives of different immigrant communities. There were different solutions that were found to reach out to different groups. And I think these same principles to reach out as broadly as possible are absolutely useful going forward in other crisis situations, but also more generally in the day-to-day work of the administration. So here also a recommendation to really learn from this and keep these channels and methods alive.
Right, thank you, Nora. Does anyone have any initial reflections on these? And I'd also maybe might be a good opportunity, because I think I think a lot of these are, I think these are kind of recommendations which you would think of, they're kind of quite straightforward in some ways. But I think one of the most interesting one is this third from the bottom, to think holistically whenever possible when developing and implementing transition policies. And I think one case study which really brought that up was the Helsinki case. And I don't know if Victor is with us today, if you could maybe give us a quick clarification on this and how this idea of thinking holistically was adopted in Helsinki, if you hear Victor.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, this was a really interesting thing sort of coming out of several interviews, really in different parts of and departments of the very large city administrative organization that Helsinki is. But it's relatively compartmentalized, and talking to a lot of the different respondents, it was clear that really an effect that the pandemic has had here is that we see a lot more both ad hoc and clearly long-term planning now in sort of horizontal groups, policy groups that would absolutely not have occurred without the sort of the push of the pandemic to both, as Nora highlighted earlier, to sort of highlight some of the problems where potentially some of the policy areas that Helsinki has been pushing very, very successfully for the past years in digitalization and so on, might not have sort of been connected before the pandemic as much as it should have to, for instance, to the social sector and to highlight problems there. So so on the whole, it really is a clear sort of impact of the pandemic here that a very efficient but still very compartmentalized and relatively siloed sort of city organization has found and has sort of been pressed to find new ways to work together, and this is sort of, but this is clear across, as I said, across a whole range of examples, ranging from you know, SDG implementation to especially the healthcare sector, where there's been a clear sort of approachment between the city and the sort of the hospital, regional hospital organization, which has also, you know, had their own data sets and operating procedures before that are now much more closer to the city's policymakers and to their strategy making. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers a bit, and of course I'm happy to take any questions on that. But I just found that a very sort of exciting finding, because you know, we perhaps approach a case study such as Helsinki thinking that there really isn't that much to learn from a city that you know, we think works quite well already and is sort of far ahead in regional development, but the pandemic clearly has had some shifts in terms of organization.
Great. Thanks, Victor. Does anybody else have any observations or comments on these overarching policy recommendations? Otherwise, we'll move on to the more specific social policy recommendations. Right. Okay. So yeah, as Nora was saying, the main focus of the project was on identifying social policy, looking at the social policy response to the crisis. And what we found was, in most case study regions, they were facing similar social challenges as a result of the crisis, and particularly in relation to supporting in providing care for some of society's most vulnerable groups, you know, including the elderly, youth, low-income families, and homeless. So in response to the crisis, we had a lot of good practice examples. So when we've put together these social recommendations, we tried to break them down into more manageable chunks. So we've put them together according to themes. So the first theme that we've looked at is, or the focus area that we've put together is this one called, which we've labeled support for vulnerable groups. So some of the recommendations we've come up with are ideas related to turning vacated commercial buildings into low-cost social housing. You know, I think this is a really important one to help the youngest and poorest in society get on the housing ladder. We also think it's important that we continue any new policy initiatives which were really focused on elderly people and vulnerable individuals, which focused on using phone and online check-ins, because this is extremely important to reduce the risk of isolation and loneliness. In quite a few in quite a few of the case study regions as well, there were kind of a lot of economic support policies at the municipal level. For example, many tenants were offered rent reductions, particularly for vulnerable families living in municipal-owned buildings, to try and reduce homelessness. And also, we would like to consider extending support for the most vulnerable families during the pandemic with reductions to energy or water bills. You know, is this something that's feasible? And this is obviously going to be something which is going to be increasingly significant as the energy crisis really takes hold. Next slide, please. The second area we looked at or came up with was one called physical and mental health. As Nora alluded to earlier, I think the crisis has had quite a significant negative impact on a lot of people's mental health situations. And I think a lot of regions and municipalities came up with quite good best practices which utilized digital tools which tried to help provide citizens with the mental health support that they needed. So, these will definitely need to be maintained as the current crisis are ongoing. Yes, we also would like to maintain policies that encourage people to live more active and healthier lifestyles. I think this is one I'm particularly interested in because I have a lot of kilos to lose from my COVID lockdown. So this is quite important. Also, the cultural offerings, which Nora talked about earlier. You know, I think this was a really good initiative that in many regions and municipalities, cultural providers like museums, cinemas, operas, theatres, and libraries that they made cultural events available to wider audiences using digital tools. So is this a good practice that can be maintained? Because, you know, Shakespeare is for the masses, not just the bourgeoisie. If we can move on to the next one. Yeah, as Nora mentioned earlier, one of the good policy practices which we found across many of the case studies was allowing businesses to utilize outdoor public spaces. You know, this was absolutely essential for keeping people in the service sector employed, because obviously the service sector was really badly hit and affected, probably the biggest employment sector across many regions, which was the hit hardest. And also on a kind of societal level, it's effective at reducing the spread of infections and just generally increasing the standard of quality of life for citizens if they have this opportunity. Finally, we also looked at this idea of adjusting social security and welfare systems to ensure that those working in the service sector in particular and those working on 0-hour contracts or are self-employed have just much greater security during crisis periods, because obviously you know, people working in the gig economy or self-employed, they were definitely the most hardest hit during the crisis. Then next slide, please. Yeah, and then we also looked at a focus area called what we called education and training initiatives, and one of the big ones was looking at probably one of the biggest affected groups during the pandemic, which was the youth and children support, particularly those children from vulnerable families, which are most at risk from falling behind. So is it possible to maintain and continue policies which place an emphasis on providing extra curricular learning and summer camps for children so they can potentially catch up with any lost education which happened during the course of the pandemic? Finally, I think we also thought it was really important the use of IT specialists is playing an important role in helping to train particularly unemployed young people or perhaps older people who lack the digital skills needed to really get employed in the knowledge economy, and is a basis for increasing their chances of getting a job on the labour market. So these were finally next slide. Oh, no, that's it. Yes, so they were the, if you go back, sorry, Sebastian. So they were the social recommendations that social policy recommendations that we came up with. So we would like to get some input now from you on, you know, what was occurring in your own regions in relation to social policies. Have any of the best practice policies which were introduced been continued? Do you think there are any best practices that should be continued, or are there any good initiatives that we've missed in our recommendations which you think should be included? Yeah, the floor is open to anybody, and also our case study partners. If you have any comments and thoughts, or you'd like to jump in, please feel free to do so. Yeah, Marianne, you have your hand up.
Hi, a few little points, if I might. I think you've done what you've got is really nice and clear, but just something that I would have liked to see a bit stronger in there is about the energy saving measures. You pointed out that the situation of more people working from home has put an increased pressure on their bills, heating bills. And I would really like to see a huge step change in the amount of support we give to housing to make sure that they are energy efficient, including solar panels and whatnot, as well as insulation. And the other thing I thought was interesting was that there seemed to be a reduction in transport with more people working from home, and a change in the development plans for housing. We are seeing huge pressure in rural areas as people want to work and earn city money and spend at a rural rate. So, and which is understandable, but that is changing planning. So we've got much bigger pressure on the rural areas where we do not have the facilities. Thanks.
Yeah, we actually came up with some recommendations in relation to the green transition and smart transition, which we didn't have time to go through today, which address some of these issues. But actually, Marianne, I mean, you make an interesting point with regard to the energy savings. I mean, do you think this is something that can be influenced at the local level, or is this something that's got to really be done in collaboration with the national? Or
it is in collaboration in UK, because we have local plans which are set up by the municipalities, and that sets the rules. And in those rules, we have put that we want housing to be energy efficiency by 2025, I think it is, which fits with the national legislation. And it would be stronger if it was straight in the building regulations, so we didn't have to put it as a policy. And of course, as we know, when there's a viability assessment on the homes that are coming forward for planning, things such as energy saving measures can be put aside for other requirements, perhaps like affordable housing or some improvements in road or health. So it would be much more straightforward if it was in the building regulations. So I think you're right, it does have to be a partnership approach. And I would certainly like our council, and if we had government grants as well. And we do have a lot of housing. My council has 3,800 houses, and at least 50 of those are right at the bottom of energy efficiency. So there's a lot we could do ourselves if we put our money where our mouth is. Thank you.
And I think there's actually a lot of just sometimes what I hear from the sidelines from other projects that go on here at Nordregio. There's a lot of interesting initiatives in the Nordics, in Europe, which relate to increasing energy efficiency in public owned housing. So I think there's, again, a lot to learn from each other there.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
thanks for your inputs, Marianne. Okay, I think if no one else has got any comments on the social recommendations, I think we'll just take a 5-minute interlude, if that's all right, just to allow people just to quickly freshen up, go to the toilet, grab a coffee, and we'll start again in 5 minutes. So around 3:22 approximately. Okay, so we'll see you again, and then we're going to tackle the governance recommendations. Okay, we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to continue on looking at the governance recommendations, and I think already you can see there's quite a big interest in discussing the impact of the crisis on governance at the local level, and I think the crisis has had a major impact on governance structures at the regional local level, and I think the crisis's impact on governance in probably three main ways that we've identified from across the case studies. First of all, it's fostered greater collaborative governance between regional and municipal level institutions. Secondly, I think it's increased collaboration between local public authorities and other important stakeholders groups within regions, particularly healthcare and social care providers, societal groups, and also working more with business. And across some of the case studies, we saw greater interactions between Chamber of Commerce and business networks with the local government, and also an increasing role for universities in providing expertise in evidence-based policymaking. Thirdly, I think we've also seen across the case studies increased collaboration internally between different departments within both regions and municipal authorities. So what we're seeing, however, is that increased institutional and stakeholder collaboration was obviously much stronger in nation states with decentralized systems of governance, where local authorities have a greater scope and responsibility to develop and implement their own policies. Of course, in the more centralized system, the local level was much more restrained by top-down policy provisions from the national government. So we've come up with a number of governance recommendations, and again, we've broken them down to themes. So the first ones you can see here, and it's already a debate that we've had in the first half of the workshop relating to multi-level cooperation. And I think there's a clear need. Well, it's one of the ironies of the pandemic, actually, is that in many areas, the national governments kind of took control, but they were also highly reliant on local level and regional level stakeholders to implement policies. So I think, it's kind of the crisis has exacerbated this need for much better collaboration between national and regional municipal level authorities to ensure that they're to help identify policy synergies and share resources and expertise in the implementation of policies. We also, looking at the EU level, we think there is much more opportunities for a direct exchange of learning and knowledge between local level actors at the EU level. So perhaps there's scope for the development of maybe a crisis management learning platform, which we could use to exchange good practices, like we're doing right now, but it could be more formalized and institutionalized. Also, something that came up quite a lot was the need to really integrate the role of local authorities in social side, non-profit groups, NGOs, societal groups, much better integrated into the policymaking processes at the EU level. And this is mainly to ensure that the local perspective is much better represented, in that the policies which are come up with meet the needs of citizens. We also identified quite a few recommendations at the local level in the impact of the crisis on local level cooperation. And primarily, I think one important thing that was happening across many cases was that there was much more cross-departmental interaction within regions, and they were establishing, and I think would like this to continue post-pandemic, because I think it's absolutely essential to ensure that there's much stronger links between departments internally within organizations to avoid policy duplication, to avoid the reuse of funds for the same types of things. Also in many of the case study regions, we saw that the interaction was improving between authorities through the use of digital tools. In fact, a lot of local and municipal and regional actors said it was actually easier to cooperate between municipalities during the pandemic than it was beforehand, which I thought that's quite an interesting development. Can these digital online platforms that have been either set up, can they be continued as the pandemic moves forward? Next slide, please, Sebastian. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, we've seen much much better collaborative governance between municipal and regional authorities and other key stakeholder groups in the region. So we think it's really important that we continue to promote a continuous dialogue with local policymakers and particularly NGOs and civil society groups to ensure that the policies which are developed at the local level really meet the needs of vulnerable groups. Also, I think it's really important that we continue to foster cross-sectoral collaboration. We did see in some case study regions, for example, in IASI, in Romania, in Amsterdam, in Milan, in Helsinki, that a number of platforms in Malmo as well, a number of platforms were created with a particular focus on creating links between local authorities, industries, businesses, and universities to ensure that any policies created really maximize the areas of regional growth potential. Also, we thought that the crisis has really been a catalyst for improving coordination between regional local authorities and public healthcare providers. And I think this most clearly came across in the Milan case, actually, where crisis units were developed, and there was much stronger links between the local health authorities and the local authorities. Finally, we also noted across the case studies that there was this need to consult with experts much more widely, and this was particularly in relation to the role of university research centres and academics. And I think the crisis really kind of highlighted this tension between policymakers and experts particularly, what is the role of experts within policymaking, particularly during times of crisis, and particularly when it comes to providing evidence-based policy, which will potentially help overcome misinformation in these kind of conspiracy theories, which are ongoing, particularly in relation to the vaccinations. So I'd like to first of all maybe invite some of our policy partners to come in here on the governance recommendations, because I think it would be particularly interesting to hear from maybe David and Gus in Amsterdam, or Hansi in Vesprem, because you were coming from very centralized systems of governance. So I mean, I'd be interested to know, I mean, we've got a recommendation here on trying to increase collaboration between the national, regional, local level. I mean, do you guys think that this was improved during the crisis, or has there been any strengthening of those links during the crisis, which can be potentially moved forward? Also, I'd like to maybe Eduardo in Elvez. You noted that there was the relationship between inter-authority relationships really improved during the crisis. I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on that a little, but maybe I could reach out to you guys first, and then we can take some feedback from the floor as well.
Shall I start? From Amsterdam, David?
Yes, David, please.
Okay. Well, you asked me about the multi-level governance first, but I'm not sure if that's changed or improved much. I think in our case, the national government implemented its own policies and some major, let's say, protection policies to avert economic crisis and unemployment and things like that. And that gave latitude to the local governments to, let's say, fill in the gaps and do more tailor-made policy. So I don't know if the whole governance vertically has changed all that much as part of the pandemic. We do see more on the others. So if I may, I'd like to take a couple of the others, where in Amsterdam, we noticed at the city level, there was a kind of a crisis unit in government to talk every Monday about the most pressing needs to tackle the pandemic. And then that was done in a very holistic way. And councilmen, who many times are in competition with each other, they discuss things in a much more, let's say, cooperative, collaborative manner than before. And this was something that I think they're going to carry through, because they see this as a culture shift in the local politics. So the pandemic really did seem to engender that. was done because it was necessary at the beginning, but I think people now see that it's also efficient and probably also a nicer way of running a city. And I think the last point, consult widely with experts. We saw that in Amsterdam as well. It's one of the first things that was done. It was this initial shock of the pandemic, what was happening. Amsterdam consulted 12 different preeminent scientists in different fields and asked for their input. And that was bundled together in kind of a book. And that kind of helped lay the groundwork for some of the municipal policies. So I think that was quite helpful in, let's say, diffusing some of the panic and asking for academic reflection from a variety of fields on what was happening.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a main hope here is that we don't go back to kind of business as usual governance systems, in that we will learn from this. I don't know if is Fulvio or Emanuela from Milan present, because there were some interesting governance developments there, which I don't know if you'd like to have the opportunity to elaborate on, or if there's any other questions from the audience, please. Or Andrea, is there anything in the chat?
Yes, we have some interesting comments from Milan Lombardi, from Fulvio, and he's noted that the Renaissance program in reality was the agreement between administration and municipalities and the lending institution, funding for them to operate, to still operate and encourage smart working of workers. So not stopping the productions. We have some comments from Mrs. Carol Thomas, which says that the experience were much more nuanced throughout the CMR members, and they highlighted that. Maybe she would be interested in and she would be willing to elaborate a bit more on this. We have some additional comments on the social recommendations, which we will take on board later on. And for Barcelona, we have received the comment that the creation of the local experience bank is a good example for coordination and sharing good practices. So these are just a few from the comments from the chat.
Thanks, Andrea. I was wondering if Mihail was here from the IASI case, because there were some interesting governance developments there, particularly I thought the B2C platform and the Social Emergency Centre. I don't know if you'd like to give any elaboration on those, if you're here, Mihail.
Yes, John, thank you. Well, one of the main results of our case study is the fact that perhaps the most innovative measures have been taken as a result of bottom-up approaches. There was no top-down approach in their respect, and basically all of them have been at the initiative of the NGOs and civil society, and not at the initiative of public authorities. And but at the same time, their implementation and these measures have been put in place as a result of a collaborative approach between NGOs, helped by private companies and public authorities. So the main policy implication would be that this case study suggests that innovative approaches emerge as a result of bottom-up approaches and collaborative approaches.
Great, thanks, Michal. I think these bottom-up approaches are going to become increasingly more important as well, because it's manifestly clear that I think we're going to be going through another period of austerity here, where I think public, regional and municipal level authorities are going to be hit on the financial side of things. So these community-led actions are going to become increasingly more important. So if there's anything we could learn from these going forward, I think that's going to be quite important. So I think we'll stop there with the governance recommendations, and then we'll move forward with the territorial recommendations. That's all right, Sebastian? All right, great. So the territorial recommendations that we came up with in the project, they're pretty much split into kind of two thematic areas. Firstly, we had a number of recommendations which predominantly focus on cross-border regions. And then secondly, we had recommendations primarily focus on enhancing urban-rural linkages. Now, I don't think this is a major surprise, because I think the pandemic had a really serious impact on the lives of people living in cross-border regions in particular, mainly because of the border closures, Also, I think during the pandemic, we saw potentially the start of a possible kind of reverse urbanization trend, where there was some out-migration processes from cities to more rural areas, more peri-urban areas. And that was mainly because Home Office gave people greater flexibility of movement in relation to where they performed their jobs. So we came up with, starting with the cross-border cooperation, we really wanted to kind of get this message across that, national level actors need to consult much more widely with cross-border committees and local public authorities in cross-border areas, particularly during crisis periods, to help minimize the obstacles to citizens working and living in cross-border areas. I think this particularly came across in the Elvas case, in the Malmo case. Of course, in Malmo, there's a huge cross-border region between Copenhagen in Malmo, where a lot of people live in Malmo because it's much cheaper to live, but they work in Copenhagen, so they're coming across. And there was quite a lot of issues, particularly in Scandinavia, where there was almost kind of some shaming going on between different nations who had different COVID laws, and it really kind of broke down trust within a Nordic context. Also, within the cross-border context, we thought about the possibility to establish cross-border crisis management units. These would bring together local authorities and cross-border committees to think about resilience, to think about future planning for future shock scenarios like pandemics. We also explored the need for much greater cross-border, inter-regional and inter-municipal cooperation in the delivery of key public services. And I think we saw that actually in a lot of cross-border regions where different regions at different sides of the borders were actually helping each other with the transfer of key medical equipment, for example. So they were the main cross-border cooperation recommendations that we came up with. When it comes to rural-urban linkages, we wanted to, we think it's really important to explore the potential of remote working as a means of revitalizing rural areas. But obviously to do that, I think what's most essential is that the infrastructure is there in rural areas for providing good quality broadband digital connections. Also, is in an attempt to revitalize rural areas, we need to look at policies which are designed to improve mobility links between urban and rural areas. And I think these are quite commonly recognized issues and challenges which need to be addressed. Also, I think a big thing that came out of the pandemic was that a lot of rural areas there was when it comes to rural businesses and tourism, it became a lot more popular because people couldn't travel as widely, so staycations became a lot more popular. So is this another route for kind of revitalizing rural areas by really zooming in providing investment in support to rural businesses and in tourism? Yeah, so if there's any reflections on these, please speak up. I'd actually like, I mean, is Eduardo with us today? Because obviously the cross-border issues were particularly strong in the Elvas region, and there were quite a lot of these recommendations came from that case study. So is Eduardo with us, and he could maybe elaborate on some of these things? No. Nope.
Is there perhaps someone else who has some experience? I mean, we had the Malmö case study and we had the Elvas case study, but is there perhaps someone here with us who experienced other challenges in border areas or would like to add to those rural-urban linkages? Some experiences from your own work or from your own places where you live? No, otherwise you can, you're very welcome to also add something to the text, as I see you've also been very active there. So if you have anything to add there or any reflection that come to you later, please feel free to add there as well.
Yeah. Okay, then we'll move on to the final group of recommendations, which are the financial recommendations. Now, as a smaller part of the case studies, we ask the case study leaders to see whether the crisis has led to any new or innovative forms of public and private financing. And I think for the most part, the policy response was largely funded by public money, mainly from the national level. But what we found within regions, particularly in decentralized systems of governance, local public authorities did often supplement national funding with regional money. And I think some of the examples of that we gave in relation to the social policies earlier, for example, providing rent relief or assisting some vulnerable families with their water bills or their heating bills. But in the more centralized systems, we also saw many community-led finance raising initiatives. For example, I think it was in Vesprem where local societies and NGOs, they use crowdsourcing as a mechanism for raising money to support some of the social challenges presented by the pandemic. So on the basis of these findings, we've split up some of the recommendations by different themes. The first one is related to inclusive financial planning, and is there scope to increase the role of regional actors, stakeholders and citizens in determining how money is spent within the region. For example, one of the funds, EU Next Generation Fund, is there scope for much more public participatory and budgetary planning mechanisms which can potentially be used there? For example, in the IASI case, they presented the potential for using participatory budgeting as a method for engaging citizens at the local level to determine the direction of regional spending. So you know, are these citizen engagement mechanisms, are they something that can be explored further? We also looked at the diversification of finance. In one of the recommendations here is can we explore opportunities for raising private and community resources to help address the most pressing problems. I've given a couple of examples of kind of bottom-up community-led. We struggled across the case studies to find any examples of private sector funding and private sector financial support for policies. In fact, I don't think we found any, did we? But maybe the case study leaders can come in there, but if we're wrong. Finally, we looked at this issue of, and I think this is a really essential one, this need to tie public funding to just green smart transition requirements. So in other words, we need to set incentives for companies and organizations to move their businesses in the desired directions to support the green and smart transitions. Finally, we came up with some recommendations related to financial savings, and as I said earlier, I think these are going to become increasingly more important. And I think the first one is that we talked earlier about departmental interactions becoming much more online and much more digital. I think this is one kind of policy or governance approach and interactive approach that will need to be maintained, because it'll just simply avoid the poor use of financial resources and avoid double spending. Also, this kind of practice of digital meetings as well, it'll reduce travel costs. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there, and if anyone has any comments on these. Also, I don't know if Hansi or Michal, if you have any further information on these kind of bottom-up fundraising initiatives, please feel free to add something there.
One of the examples that I remember, for example, when it comes to tying the granting of public funding to different requirements, I mentioned a couple of those as well when I gave my presentation. I think Amsterdam, there was quite a lot of initiatives in that area. I remember, David, you, for example, you included a measure where KLM, the airline, was supported with a lot of funding, but that was closely tied to certain requirements to become more sustainable. And I mentioned two examples, I think, from Amsterdam also, where businesses and freelancers were supported with funds on good conditions, but always sort of with a certain extra incentive to develop further or to improve digital tools, for example, or things like that. I don't know, David, if you want to comment on this, or is there any experience if these initiatives have worked well, for example, if they had some desired effects? Can you share a little more on that, perhaps?
Okay, well, first of all, most of the things that you mentioned were not implemented by Amsterdam, but by the national government. And the main one, it was billions and billions of euros, and it was done support given to businesses for lost income, but also mainly to pay their workers. And so even if there was no income coming in from the business, they could continue to pay wages, and that would prevent unemployment. And when you look at the beneficiaries of this, and this is one thing that we put in the, let's say, green transition, you see that it's airlines and casinos and some other companies where you think, are those the ones that are socially and environmentally the best companies to just indiscriminately give money to without any strings attached? There weren't any conditions set on this type of policy. You also mentioned the ones for freelancers, and they also were able to get some support from the national government. The Netherlands is one of the main countries in Europe which uses freelancers, and so a large part of the population immediately found themselves in a precarious situation. So this was trying to keep these people from descending into poverty. So it's a very social idea, not so much a financial one or economic one. And after a few months, they were going to discontinue this, and they wanted to have these people prove that the type of profession they were doing really was worthwhile in terms of finances. So if it was not, they were then given incentives to retrain. And this has also come under criticism by, for example, artists who are freelancers, who are then told that, well, your art doesn't pay very much, so maybe you should retrain to be something else. That's more of a life decision. So yeah, these are the national government things. There were also, I guess it's not necessarily financial, but oh yeah, the last point, the digital meetings. Also not really a financial thing, but that we really did see that for our regional development, and we have a regional partnership of municipalities. This actually the pandemic helped in the sense that all the meetings became online, and it was much, much easier to schedule meetings between municipalities as a result of the pandemic. Probably this is going to be carried forward.
All right, thanks, David. All right, great. Well, I think as a final section of today, firstly, I'd just like to thank you for your ideas and inputs, and say big thanks to our case study leaders who have done a great job over the last few months putting together their reports. Yeah, but as a final part of the workshop, I noticed Carol has already made a comment in the chat. So I'd like to invite Carol Thomas from the Council of Municipalities and Regions to reflect on what she's heard today and how she thinks these findings contribute towards the work of the Council moving forward. So Carol, if you're with us, yeah, it would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, it's okay.
You can. I've just got a bit of an echo at my end.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Right. Is that okay? You hear me clearly?
Much better.
You hear me?
Yes. Better.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. Yes. Thanks very much to you and to John and all your colleagues. I've actually been here throughout the meeting and been put a couple of comments into the chat in actual fact. So thank you. It's been a very rich afternoon of discussions, and you know, we kicked off, of course, with my colleague Dermish, starting us off and just giving you a little bit of insight to the work that CEMR right at the beginning of the pandemic with our member associations, which has been, I'm very pleased to say, you've reflected, and much of what has been said and been shared during our afternoon of discussions over the last couple of hours has been very much supported by the kinds of experiences, the kinds of input contributions that we had coming from our CEMR members right at the beginning of the pandemic, right through now until currently. We have a number of expert groups that are working on issues as broadly as climate change, territorial cohesion, governance issues, and so I'm pleased to say that so much of what I've heard this afternoon and in terms of the recommendations that you're looking to come forward and which you're looking to conclude in your final report resonate very much with the work that we've been doing with our members over the CEMR over the last couple of years. What I've been very struck by, of course, is the issue of whilst we've looked at different aspects of the recommendations, whether it be on territorial recommendations, on the issues relating to the just transition. We've had our financial recommendations as well, and the governance recommendations. What I've been very struck by is how important, quite clearly, the whole issue of governance and good governance processes has been core very much to the issue of how well localities, municipalities, communes, regions have been able to deal with the pandemic and address the issues that they've been faced with. It's certainly something that we've been very struck by in the discussions that we've had with our members, and that's been very much, in your 14 case studies, that's come through very strongly. Whether we've been talking about issues linked to best practices as well. I was, one of the quite clearly different platforms that have come together to be able to share experiences about how to deal with an emergency situation in real time. Much of that was on the basis of best practice and how to learn from that and to share from that. I was rather surprised though in one of your recommendations where you talked about the need to have more networks and platforms, because it seems to me that there have been and there are many that are already in place and have been working and been able to be used by local and regional authorities very quickly and we put those to good use. So whether we need to have more of those, or whether it's more about using those platforms of exchange that are already in place, I have a question mark about that. That's, you know, open for debate, but quite best practice is going to be critical, helping us to learn from each other about how to tackle crises, because we will continue, of course, to face to crises, and the partnership approach in order to help us to be able to link together different levels of the government, whether it be the national, whether it be regional, local, is going to help us to be able to see how we look forward and how we move forward to together. I was struck as well by the point that was made that, of course, we have many best practices available to us, but we need to be mindful about the fact won't always have the same results or outcomes from different ways of doing things, depending on the institutional culture, as was raised by one of my colleagues earlier on in our discussions. I also wanted to talk about just coming back and just finishing off, you know, with this whole area of, because I think it is very, you know, critical to think about what the pandemic is like, is already triggering within our countries, within different local and regional levels. The pandemic is a crisis, of course, we all understand that. We've had several crises as well take place. We have another one that's underway, unfortunately, with the Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine. But if we go back also to the 2008 crisis, what we found is that these crises very often have triggered governance and territorial reforms, which then in themselves leads to changes of relationships between different tiers of government. And so I think we shouldn't, and we already see that happening in Italy. They've taken a hard and long look, of course, at what happened during the health emergency, and they are looking to see how they can advance and look at their health systems and how those needs to change to be better able to confront future crises. In Finland, we are aware through our national association that a recent review of has introduced a new tier of government, a new regional tier of government that is looking at making the health sector more patient-centric, and looking at how we can better deliver services that put the citizens at the centre. So, you know, we need to be thinking as well about how these recommendations as well are not only helping us to think about addressing crises, but the fact of having crises in and of themselves are triggering changes between how different tiers of government are thinking about how they need to do things better, but what those implications are and how you go about making better relationships between tiers of government, how to make that relationship work better. Because as I briefly said in the chat earlier, it's not a straightforward equation between whether a country is very highly centralized or whether it's decentralized. It wasn't necessarily a silver bullet in terms of helping us to address the crises well. What was critical and what was important was a coordinated and good cooperation across and between tiers of government. That was really what was critical, as opposed to whether a country was decentralized or more or less decentralized. We found here in Belgium, our Belgian colleagues said to us that in certain circumstances it was actually quite difficult with managing the crisis response. Similarly in Germany as well, it wasn't a completely rosy picture between the federal government and those the lender in terms of agreeing what needed to be done. So you know, we need to be mindful of issues as well. But as I say, at the heart of it, is for me is very much considering those governance recommendations and the relationships between all of those stakeholders who need to be involved and who need to be taken along with regard to what we all need to do to be making sure that we're delivering the kind of policies and that we're listening to how citizens feel that we can do better for them, really. So I hope that helps a little bit with your discussions. I'm not quite sure whether that's what you're expecting, but you know, for us it was a very rich opportunity to take part in ESPON's work and hopefully make those relevant and resonate with kind of the policies that we need for the future, not least of which to make all of our territories more resilient.
Thank you very much, Carol. Absolutely appreciate it. Very good comments and helpful for us to finalize our work, and many points are well taken. I just wanted to very quickly comment on two things you said, and the time is running out, so I'll try to keep it very, very short. I think your point is very well taken about our recommendation, whether we need more networks and more opportunities. That is absolutely correct, and I agree with you. And I thought perhaps we need to kind of sort of rephrase our recommendation, not simply to point to more networks, but to see also how we can reach those who need to have this exchange of information, because the topic did came up. So I think there were definitely representatives in different municipalities who perhaps felt they didn't get enough input, but then it's probably more a question how to reach all of these groups and to make sure everyone has an opportunity to get and exchange information. So this is a point well taken, and we take that into account. And I also just like to comment on the point of best practices and how easily they are transferable between systems having different cultures in their administrations. And again, a point that was brought up earlier, and I completely agree, but I think one thing that makes this even more interesting is that we've heard now also during this workshop how the pandemic itself has created some changes in work culture. So this seems to be a very moving target, where as we're trying to discuss best practices and keeping in mind that administrations work differently across countries and within countries, again, the culture itself is changing, and how best to then accommodate that. So I think this is a very complex but highly interesting question that I think we will also ponder with a little more going forward. So thank you very much for your input here.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo what Nora's just said. Thank you very much, Carol. I think you've given us some real food for thought there, particularly in relation to using existing platforms more effectively. I'd also like to say, look, as a governance wonk, I just love anything related to governance, and I do generally think that the crisis has not so much been a window of opportunity in relation to pushing particular policy agendas, although it's manifestly clear that certainly the crisis has given momentum to digital policies and maybe some green transition policies, but I think actually the crisis has been a much bigger catalyst towards improving governance structures, particularly between local authorities and healthcare infrastructure. But more importantly, I think it provides a catalyst for really empowering the subnational level, in particularly strengthening the role of the subnational level in relation to national and EU level, multi-level governance policy-making processes. So I'm hoping that moving forward now that this crisis is really going to further raise the significance of the subnational level moving forward. So I think we're going to have to wrap things up there. We've gone 4 minutes over. That's pretty good in workshop terms, I think. So look, I hope everyone, I'd like to thank you all for participating. I hope you've enjoyed the day and found some of the findings from the project and discussions really interesting and informative and helpful with your daily work moving forward. Just to say that the final reports for the project, they're going to be available at the end of June. So please look out for those on the ESPON website, on LinkedIn. There'll be something very nice for you to read on the beach while Sebastian's topping up his tan. That'll be very useful. So with that, I'd like to say again, thank you for joining. Wish you all a lovely evening and have a fantastic summer. See you soon. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.